What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Week 9 Cash Game Review Show. I am TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4, as always, with my co-host, Matt Savoca. Every week, we get into our cash lineups. Matt covers his FanDuel lineups. I cover my DraftKings lineups. Talk about what worked, what didn't work, what we could change, just how we could get better, how we can get you guys better at DFS cash games. Matt, how was your week?
Hey, it was pretty good. I had a rough week last week and kind of
Yep.
bounced back a little bit. 56th percentile, but I noticed in the big double up, my score, my exact score,
Mm-hmm.
114.64, was the cash line despite being in the
Mm-hmm.
56th percentile. So a lot of
Nice.
duplicate scores here.
Yeah, yeah.
I had some positive variance, won 70% of my head-to-heads, double ups, and
Nice.
50-50s. And yeah, 52% ROI. We will take that.
Yeah, yeah,
After
one of
last
the
week's FAF.
yeah, definitely. We'll get into it. One of the lowest scoring weeks of the season. Chalk busts pretty much everywhere outside of Lamar, and I guess Chubb was kind of chalky. I didn't think he was going to be, but we'll get into that a little bit. But look, I always look at the scores just across all buy-ins on DraftKings because you're able to access lineups that you didn't play or contests that you didn't play, which you can't do on FanDuel without having a link to it. But yeah, lowest scores in 50-50s, double ups by far this week. So it didn't take a lot to win, but I mean that we don't really care about that, right? We're caring about as long as our process is right. Like sometimes the chalk's gonna hit, sometimes it doesn't. Usually we should come out on the right side of it regardless. But let's get into your lineup, which did fairly well this week, and let's talk about your hits, your locks, things that weren't too much of really decision points for you, things that you knew you were going to play this week.
Yeah, you'll see the lineup up there this week. Lamar Jackson, Ezekiel Elliott, Devontae Booker, and then the wide receivers, Hunter Renfrow, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Albert O as my tight end, and then my flex is Austin Eckler before rounding it out with the Chiefs defense. The things that I had locked in for most of the week, Eckler was the top value
Mm-hmm.
score among all flex players, actually among all players for the entire week. Now, I will say that number shrunk, or I would say the numbers of the other players got closer to Eckler over the course of the week, but still he ended up with that top score. And then across the industry, I was seeing that Elliott was a popular play, and I saw nothing wrong with the play as well. And fitting those two in with one stud wide receiver and Lamar Jackson was ultimately the build that I settled on pretty much on Thursday or Friday, because once those wide receiver values opened up and we knew we had Albert O at tight end and we had all of these defenses against backup quarterbacks, I just felt like that was the best way to go this week. And even though Albert O doesn't hit, I still feel completely fine locking him in, knowing how much of the field was going to be with them. And like I said, once I decided on that construction, it was really just figuring out which value wide receivers to go with. A lot of the popular ones actually ended up doing pretty well. Waddle and Renfrow do well here. The other options I was kind of deciding between is Devonta Smith also had a strong game. Kadarius Toney was on that board, and he didn't do very well there. But besides that, once the Taysom news, the Trevor Siemian news hit,
Yeah.
that was the construction I was going for, and it turned out all right this week.
Yeah, I mean the once we found out Taysom wasn't playing, interestingly, usually we talk about like on DraftKings, I think it's a pretty cut and dry build. I actually thought on FanDuel this week was very cut and dry build, because once Taysom was rolled out, we see with your lineup, like it was pretty easy to get to all of our top values at 4for4. Zeke, Eckler, and Jackson all fit really easily in with Albert O and with the Chiefs defense. Like, so when I looked at FanDuel, I was actually really surprised. Like, I didn't think there was too much variance. When we got the Tua news, did you waver on Waddle at all?
I felt like I actually felt more confident because I feel like Tua,
Mm-hmm.
maybe this is more of my biases creeping in, but I actually think Gesicki has been more involved with Tua
Yep.
Tagovailoa in the
Yep.
offense. So, especially with the idea that Devontae Parker might miss extended time, just thinking almost from a front office down perspective, Miami needs to figure out what they have in Jalen Waddle as a
Yeah.
top first round pick. And so I just expect them to design a lot of plays for it. It kind of it didn't even hit that well this week, but it was good enough that we'll take it. I
Yeah,
honestly think he could get a lot more work going forward.
yeah, that game was a weird one for me because the Dolphins were favored by a decent amount. I think it got up to like 6.5 at one point. By the time the Tua news came out and lineups locked, it was down to 4.5, I think. But everybody just thought the Texans were so bad that there was lots of ways to attack them. I didn't actually love that game in terms of game flow. I wasn't excited about Gaskin as a pretty chalky pick where he was like going into Sunday. I think it might have changed a little bit. Like I don't know if people thought that with Tua in there that maybe just the whole offense would take a small decline. Was Gaskin ever on your radar as somebody that was like trending towards one of the more popular plays on FanDuel?
When I optimized lineups, he was popping up a
Yeah,
lot, and
yeah.
I just don't know if I want to bank, especially when on FanDuel, we need that production from running back, and we really need touchdown upside as well. Miles Gaskin is sort of like a receiving specialist on a team that doesn't get near the goal line all that often, and then starting a backup quarterback, it just felt like too many things needed to go right, even if the projection versus salary looked okay.
Yeah, the cheap running backs, there was Booker, Gaskin. I can't remember who the third one, but I thought it was pretty clear that Booker was in the best spot of the cheap running back groups. Now, obviously, he has a good game, almost goes for 100 yards. Well, did go for 103 yards, then got hurt and went down to 99 yards, and he lost the DraftKings bonus. Not that that happened to me or anything, but
Oh,
I thought he was in a pretty good spot. I mean, projections are always going to be pretty fragile, but I agree with you there. Before we go on to your decision points, you mentioned Kadarius Toney, and he was like, I try to listen to a small group of sharp people that aren't just 4 for 4. You like to get outside voices and try to find something you're missing. Everybody was talking about Tony, and I just like once Galladay was active and just that game flow and liking Booker and him not having a ton of sample of how he's going to be used. I actually didn't think he was that good of a play. Obviously, you didn't use him, but you mentioned him kind of being in your player pool. Like, what were your feelings on Kadarius Toney because he was getting like talked up by a lot of really sharp people this week?
well, the process for me was actually pretty simple because once I decided on Booker, as you said, it was
Yeah,
easier to project Booker's touches.
yeah,
And there weren't a lot of options in terms of low salary access to that many touches. And then
mhm,
I'm not putting two Giants in my lineup. That
yeah,
game doesn't look good enough, and so I'm off Tony at that point. I'm going with some of the other values, and Renfro honestly was the one that was sort of a lock all week.
yeah.
And then as we got closer to Sunday, Waddle just kind of uh, rose towards the top, I should say.
Yeah, I loved Renfro. I didn't end up using him in my cash lineups, but I thought he was one of the best plays of the week. I had him in a lot of GPP lineups, and on FanDuel, I was thinking like we want to chase touchdowns, and I was thinking, I don't know if Renfro necessarily has the touchdown upside. Then I actually started thinking about it, and I was like, wait, if the Raiders are going to be without Ruggs, like I don't think they're just going to keep ripping it deep with Zay Jones, and then even though Zay Jones can be deep, like they're going to do things more methodical, right? It's probably going to be long drives, and if Renfro is a good short to intermediate receiver, he's going to get looks inside the red zone. Like obviously he scores and gets there. That helps a ton. That's not going to happen all the time. But I actually
Right.
thought in that game flow ended up being disgusting. But I just thought like looking at that game, he did have touchdown upside with how I thought the Raiders were going to play. So I agree with you 100% there. Um, you had Diggs and Hill as decision points. I actually really loved Hill for his salary, but talk a little bit about your decision points that we haven't talked about yet, and then just wherever you missed that you weren't too happy about.
Sure. Yeah, Diggs and Hill was my big, what is my favorite wide receiver one? And ultimately, as I got down to Sunday, there just wasn't enough separating the two
Right.
to move away from the optionality that I had with Hill given the late swap options. So it really was one's an early game, one's an afternoon game. I can't tell between the two. And this is something we've actually talked about in previous weeks. We
Yeah.
don't want to just say, hey, this guy's a later game when the value is different. When the
Right.
value is the same and the median and the ceiling projections are about the same, Then we can go with the later game because it gives us, especially in Hill's case, so much more salary to play with. Just considering Eckler and Hill, if my 1 p.m.s go south, I had so many options. Probably some bad ones in there, but I had so many options to get to if things weren't going well. So that was honestly an easier choice once we got there. The other thing is, I did notice that both Chubb and Mixon, for their salaries, had very strong values. They didn't look like the very best plays. They sort of found themselves in the second tier, but it was one of those things where there was nothing wrong with
Yeah.
either of their spots. And it turns out that basically the best thing to have was Jackson, Mixon, Chubb, which was fairly easy to fit. Similar to my lineup with Jackson, Elliott, Eckler. If you had those three, I wrote here, all you needed was 27 points on average, and you hit the cash line on FanDuel. So whatever else you wanted to play
Yeah.
in cash, if you had those three.
Yeah, I mean the Tyreek thing, even though the Chiefs offense has been sputtering, I think against the Packers secondary, the way that the Bills have been using a lot of pass catchers, Josh Allen obviously using his legs, like neither offense gets there yesterday, but that's not the point. The point is going into the game. I actually view them when they're similar salary or at least similar value. I actually think Tyreek Hill has a lot more ceiling, and that's really important on FanDuel, obviously, where we're chasing touchdowns and ceiling. Now, obviously, we still think Diggs has some blow up games coming up, but just in that exact spot, I think Hill is the play there. I mean, Chubb is the quintessential like FanDuel versus DraftKings play. Like a lot of people just don't, you never really think of him. He has to be an insane value on DraftKings to use him, and we'll get there. But he's a player that I mean, even with listen, I use Chubb a ton in GPPs, and I'll get to my thoughts on Chubb. But like in these terms right here, we still saw 2 weeks ago or their game before last, Dearness Johnson getting some goal line work. Like Chubb is just never or almost never like an 80% backfield touch player. Like obviously he blows up. I loved him yesterday, but I don't think it's ever really egregious to not play Chubb if he's just not like a tremendous value. He was a good value, but he wasn't like a blow me away type value. So I don't think it's bad to not play Chubb yesterday. Any other thoughts on FanDuel or what you were building or just noticed in lineups?
Yeah, in general, the fact that Lamar Jackson had a lower salary than Josh Allen probably saved my day because I
Yeah.
saw Allen having the better matchup between the two, but I needed the salary even with Albert O and two
Yeah.
value wide receivers. So it's funny how sometimes you just kind of luck into these correct builds, but that's honestly
Yeah.
how it went.
Yeah, I mean it is like, yeah, sure, we're lucky that Jackson is cheaper, but I mean that is also just good process, right? Like if you intuitively know that you need that salary and you've been, you're putting a ton of work into playing cash lineups, and you have this kind of intuitive feel for how you need to build your lineup. Like, yeah, you could say like, oh man, if they're at the same price I would have played them, but that's why we have to go through all these processes, because you do just kind of naturally start falling into those things, and it feels like second nature, or maybe you didn't think about it much, but that's kind of what we're going for, right? We want to put in so much work that it starts feeling like second nature. So for sure. Anything else on FanDuel?
Yeah, only 6 total skill players hit 3x value, and two were Malik Taylor and Alamade Zacchaeus. So if you felt like
Obviously.
if you it's one of those weeks where you had to get one of the highest raw scores, Chubb, Jackson. I don't know if you're playing James Conner and cash, but Justin Herbert possibly or Matt Ryan, because your value plays probably didn't get you there alone.
Yeah, I mean, we can move on over to DraftKings, but the same point, just to go with your point, on DraftKings, which is probably similar to FanDuel, to some extent, there was 8 players that were in at least 40% of the big double up lineups. Um, Obviously, Lamar scores 36. No one else scores more than 13. So, I mean, the chalk busts in one of the biggest ways we've seen all year. But let's go ahead and move on to my DraftKings lineup. And I mean, this is basically just like the worst outcome possible for me yesterday. And I actually was like, not frustrated at all with the outcome. I had just so much locked into how I was building this lineup that I really came down to like one big decision point that made it a very bad day. So I thought it was really straightforward with most of these players. Obviously, when we get the Noah Fant news, DraftKings were punting tight end. Punt Albert, oh, that's a lock. Not even think about it. When we get the news that Aaron Rodgers is out, punt Chiefs defense. Not even thinking about it. Zeke is disgustingly mispriced as a 10-point favorite at $7,000. Not even thinking about it. Amari wasn't as popular as I thought he was going to be. I mean, I guess it's because he pops up with a hamstring super late in the week. But once I find out he's playing, I mean, if there's no hamstring, I think he probably ends up as like a 70% cash game play. I think he ended up in, I could actually check real quick. Amari ended up only, oh no, Amari was still 44% play. But I think it might be even higher without the hamstring. But at 5,700, it's like, I just don't even know how to get away from him. T. Higgins kept climbing up our value report. So by Sunday morning, I added him to my article, added him to the chat. He was just getting so much. He was getting talked about so much across the industry as a value on DraftKings. I just figured he was going to be one of the most popular plays. He ended up in 41% of lineups. So going back to that point of like, if everybody's playing these plays in cash games and we're pretty confident in our ownership projections, then that when these players whiff, even if they whiff as a group, you still aren't really losing out much on the field. And we saw that like you only needed 122. The cash line was between like 122, 123 points, depending on which game you were in, which double up or which 50-50. But I thought all of those guys were pretty straightforward. By the time I like got to that point where I knew I was playing those mid-tier receivers, I knew I was like kind of wanted Tyreek but wasn't sure. Like I was just pretty much off the cheap running backs in this build. I told the chat late Sunday morning that this is like this pretty clear 4 wide receiver build week for me. I did consider some 2 tight end builds, but I actually before I get into it, do you have any thoughts on any of those like lock plays? Because I have a lot to say about the decision points here.
Yeah, I'm completely fine with the decision to build around Ezekiel Elliott, Amari Cooper, and going to Albert O as well on the other side of that game. It's one of the highest total games. Obviously, the Dallas offense hit they're a dud last week. What can you say? But they're still implied for I believe 29 points. So that's the kind of offense that you're going to play 2 players from. And then it matches up perfectly with the value play of Albert O as a game stack. We've been talking about all year using the volatility of the tight end position and just tacking that on as a part of a game stack. So that makes a lot of sense. T. Higgins, I've been looking at his name in the breakout wide receiver model every single week, and all he does is continue to annoy me. But he finally hits 13.8 points.
Yeah, it was fun. But he wasn't that cheap on FanDuel, if I remember correctly. Like, but he was really cheap. Yeah. So he was one of those players where there was a pretty big gap. Usually it's different. The thing that obviously got me in a lot of trouble here was not playing Lamar Jackson. The thought process here was I knew I wanted to get to Tyreek or Austin Eckler. As I mentioned, most of the other guys I was pretty locked into. I was pretty sure I wanted Lamar, but I knew Lamar was going to be popular. I knew Tyreek was going to be popular. I wasn't, for the most part, I probably wasn't getting off Eckler. Like you said on FanDuel, he was projecting as one of our best plays on 4for4. I think he was the best overall value, sub 8K, getting so much work against a Philly defense that filters everything to running backs. So the thought process
honestly looked so good in that game. Like I know the fantasy points and the real life statistics don't always look, but he looked like the best player on the field for much.
He did get dinged up for a second too, right?
Yeah, he did. But yeah, when the game in crunch time, I was watching that game and he was pretty much unstoppable.
Yeah. So I mean, he doesn't get there, but I was kind of debating between him and Tyreek, and I couldn't figure out which one I wanted, and I was kind of considering Jordan Love as a punt the whole week. And my final decision was just like, if I can't decide between Eckler and Hill, like let me just play them both. And I knew like so it wasn't really so much like a Eckler versus Tyreek or even a Love versus Lamar decision. It was a Lamar versus Tyreek decision. And I knew they were both going to be popular. Lamar ends up in 64% of lineups. Tyreek ends up in 52% of lineups. Lamar smashes, Tyreek doesn't. That's pretty much the decision point for me. I considered Jacoby Brissett, obviously, because he was pretty much the same salary as Jordan Love. I think he was 4,500. Obviously, I wouldn't have been having Love going against the Chiefs defense, which I didn't even think was that egregious because they were just both so cheap, and it was getting me up to Tyreek that it's probably bad, but I just was like, these guys are like basically minimum salary. Chiefs are going to be in everybody's lineup. So look, they end up 73%. So it's like, I'm just playing them. With all of that said, I mean, I think obviously if you just don't play Lamar, you're just not getting there yesterday. Because my decision was such a dramatic one, like usually our 1v1s or 2v2s are like similarly valued wide receivers or similarly valued running backs, right? Also a lot of times similar salaries, but my decision point between Love and I don't even know who else I was going to have besides Tyreek, or Love and Tyreek and Lamar versus whoever else, was so dramatic in my mind that I actually decided to play way less cash just because I couldn't figure it out. So I was like, if I'm not comfortable in this, let me just dial it back. So I actually ended up not even posting head to heads. I played my double ups, played a couple upside games. There's a couple of things I could have done. So I actually kind of considered it a win because I was like, listen, I know this doesn't feel good. And probably like, I guess you can hedge, which I just don't like doing. I just played less. And I kind of felt good about that. I mean, obviously, if you get in the habit of doing that when you have big decisions, you're probably going to like, why are you even playing? But it was just one of those weeks where it was just such a big point. I was like, let me just go fire at a bunch of GPPs. I had a pretty dialed in GPP process this week, and it worked out good. So when those work out, you feel right. When it doesn't, you feel dumb. But it just that was what happened. But any thoughts on that before I get to my late swap?
Yeah, I think my big question for you would have been, if you play Lamar Jackson, what was your hierarchy, your rankings hierarchy for the wide receiver or the flex player that fit there? And I know you said you weren't.
I probably honestly go to like a 2 tight end build. I probably end up, I don't remember if it fit, but I think it ends up with like, I think it might have ended up with like Goddard in flex instead of Tyreek. I have to double check. But I had a lot of 2 tight end builds that I was considering. I never obviously got there with that once I decided to punt quarterback. And another thing was we haven't had the punt quarterback option in a long time. And really when you can get, I think a lot of these opportunities, obviously you're not always going to have Lamar opportunity to go nuclear, but when you could get like the 2 highest floor running backs and like the best value, high price receiver, it's always going to be super intriguing to me. Maybe I got like a little like drunk with the idea of it, but we really haven't had that option this year. So I did like it. And I don't think I was like, in terms of the players that I was combining versus the field, I wasn't really like giving up any kind of like projection equity or ownership equity or anything, because I did play like I said, it was either like Lamar and Tyreek, who was 62% versus 54%. So I still played, I think most of the obvious cash game plays. Like, I don't know, maybe it's an egregious error. I still can't decide, but I end up liking the build. But the one thing I did to try to salvage my day, once Lamar goes nuts, and then Zeke and Amari dud, and I don't remember if someone else, I guess Albert O was okay. Once my score was bad, like I just went for a crazy late swap. So I ended up, that lineup that you showed was like one that I just actually forgot to late swap in something super small, like a $5 double up or something. But my main double ups, I ended up just going like I knew, obviously I know Lamar's going nuts, and I knew I whiffed on Zeke. I knew I whiffed on Amari. Albert O really didn't do anything, and I have Jordan Love coming up, so it's like, I mean, the chances of Jordan Love catching Lamar are thin, so we can throw the late swap up. I was just like it. I just went, balls to the wall. It completely whiffs, which I don't even care about at that point, because as you saw before, my original lineup was still 15 points off the cash line. So I just got off everybody. I got off Eckler. I got off Keenan Allen. I got off of Tyreek. I got off the Chiefs. Got a 49ers, Kelsey, Mike Williams, Aaron Jones. I mean, it really wasn't even like that much to like think about. I knew the Chiefs were going to be crazy popular. I knew Tyreek was going to be crazy popular. So I swapped them out, and then like think about where I can go. And Mike Williams and Aaron Jones just kind of take care of themselves. So we've talked a ton about late swap here before. I mean, this was one of those cases where it was just like, it was so bad early that it was just an easy decision point just to, throw Hail Marys, because really with Lamar going that crazy, there was no point in try to like tiptoe and like, oh, let me try to keep Keenan in, or let me keep Tyreek in. Like if they're even a little popular, I'm not catching anybody anyway. If they can score 50, and I'm not catching anybody because everybody has so much of them. So it was just like a super easy pivot everywhere. And then you see Mike Williams is 1% of lineups. Travis Kelce's in 1.5% of lineups. The Niners are only in less than 7% of lineups against Arizona with the backup quarterback because they were the late game. Aaron Jones only in 9% of lineups. So it was just like a easy mass swap for me there.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The only thing I might have looked at is when I saw, and obviously you don't know that the late games are going to be like this. When I saw the scores coming in so low across the board in terms of fantasy scoring, I do kind of wonder if there was another pathway when we had both Justin Herbert and Jalen Hurts in the late swap saying, I need the highest raw points. Now, I totally understand where you're going with this build. You needed to go off the wall, but with players who had massive ceilings, and every single person you switch to has gigantic 25 to 30 point ceilings. Even Travis Kelce here.
Exactly.
The only thing is, I think maybe you have the slightly higher probability of 30 points in a Hurts or a Herbert. It really,
yeah. I was trying to get there. Like, I think basically the main reason I didn't do that is because I couldn't really figure out a running back to switch to. Like, obviously Connor went bonkers, but that's only because
Edmonds went down.
Edmonds get hurt. So like there wasn't really a cheap late running back that I could play. Like it would have had to been like Darrell Williams, which I guess could have been okay, but I just couldn't find a cheap running back to make it work.
That makes sense.
I mean, obviously there's lots of maneuvering I could have done, but it felt like I would have been taking like a pretty big hit at running back. And it's like, and the thought is like, I guess if Jordan Love can get me to like 20 something and everybody else hits their ceiling, that's the only way I'm really getting there without getting, like, I would have had, I felt like I needed ceiling from all of the spots, and I didn't feel like there was a ceiling running back available.
I think that's completely fair. And Jones definitely had the ceiling.
Yeah. As I mentioned, I thought about playing two lineups, which I never did. In retrospect, I wish I would have thought about just throwing an early only lineup out there with Lamar, because I ended up playing Lamar in a bunch of early morning tournaments. So, I could have just it wouldn't have been a hedge. It's two different slates. So that would have made sense. I thought about, like, I never really thought about adding Chubb to my cash game pool. I played him like pretty much everywhere in GPPs, but the reason I didn't really consider him much in cash, even though he was a decent value, I was like, I don't think the field's going to be on him that much. He ended up in like 30% of cash games. So obviously all the Lamar Chubb builds, that's what really worked. But I guess I just wasn't really on him as a consideration for cash games just because of what we talked about before. So I guess I guess you could think about that when ownership is flat like that. Like I've talked about with GPP, sometimes you can have some surprises, and if you factor that into like your uncertainty, like you're uncertain about your projections, then then you can include him. But again, he still only ends up in like 30% of cash game lineups. So it's not like he was like overwhelming the field. He was just like, I think we had him at 15% in the millie and he ends up in 21%. So like our projection wasn't crazy off. He was just a little higher in cash games than I
This was
thought.
Lamar.
Chubb.
Chubb, yeah.
Yeah. So the Lamar Chubb lineups get there, and then that's basically what we saw show up because everybody was building around that early core that I ended up talking about. So let's move on to some overarching topics. I mean, a ton of surprises. So I mean, I don't know. I don't have too many to touch on. I mean, but you could talk about some that caught you off guard.
Yeah, I think the early one is that if Chase Edmonds missed time, certainly James Conner looks like a player who's going to be extremely valuable going forward. Obviously has a huge game with all the workload, but he was already scoring touchdowns at an extremely high clip. If he's going to be the every down back with Kyler Murray coming back into the fold, that is definitely something we're going to have to pay attention to. And then the two major top five offenses that just completely fall on their face. The Buffalo Bills get smacked around by the Josh Allen of the Jaguars,
Yeah.
and Denver just completely taking it to Dallas. Why in the world were the Dallas starters down 30, still in the game with, I don't know, 6-7 minutes left trying to score? Just ridiculous.
Because they also had Zeke and Amari in cash and they were trying to get there.
I hope so. I mean, I'm thankful for that, but man.
I was surprised that the Chargers didn't do anything to get Mike Williams more involved. I talked about over the weekend how I noticed that he had a huge increase in average depth of target, and that coincided with a huge drop in target share. I thought against this Philly defense that was very obvious, one that funneled passes underneath, like no one was trying to throw deep against them, and also not succeeding throwing against them, that they had been sharp enough in their play con that they're like, all right, let's at least go back to early season Mike Williams and get him a little more involved, and they didn't. So that really surprised me. I thought there were some opportunities in that game for them to really run away with it, and they just never did. So that was a pretty big surprise for me. I mean, we haven't had as I said, the segment gets shorter each week. I thought your process was really good this week. Anything that you noticed that you wanted to tweak?
I don't have any major things right now. I kind of feel like I'm finally getting the hand building part that I kind of come from and mixing it with the optimizer. I feel like I'm in a pretty good place. Obviously, we're gonna have to stay on it week to week, but no big changes right now.
Yeah, one thing that I think, this isn't so much for myself, but some 4for4 Discord users have just been talking about the struggles of cash games, and obviously everybody is getting sharper. I think pretty much anybody playing at least head-to-heads at this point has access to some kind of DSF subscription and a lineup generator, and we are seeing, there's a ton of overlap in lineups. I think if you have been playing for a long time, you have to be able to shift your mindset in cash games like this. Cash games aren't this thing where you are going like early on in DFS. The reason people were playing a ton of cash games versus GPPs is because cash games were like the steady bankroll builder, right? It was like, let me return my 20% every single week all season and just get that 20% return bonus Christmas check at the end of the year. It's just you have to accept it as another volatile game. Like you're gonna have down weeks, you're gonna have up weeks. You want your big weeks to be better than your down weeks, and the way to do that is to be building upside into your lineups. If you're not playing high volume, you shouldn't be playing head to head. My recommendation is you want to be playing at least 30 contests at one buy-in level to like get the real realization of your lineup, how good your lineup is. I think you can be playing a bigger mix. Like if you were playing, say, $100 in head-to-heads, if you were playing $70 of that in head-to-heads and $30 in double-ups and multipliers, I think there is an argument to be made where you make that 50-50, where you're just playing 50% of your cash games and head-to-heads. But I think the point is that if you think you are still EV in cash games, and you have to have a very honest conversation with yourself, that if you are not really benefiting from your biggest weeks, and that means you should be putting your lineups in some triple ups. I play triple ups, 5Xs, and 10Xs with my cash lineups with like a small percentage of them. I put them in, and we've talked about that. We have full theory segments on this. Put them into small GPPs. I put them in these like 45-man winner take alls. If you hit that once, it pays for itself for the season. If you hit it twice, you have a great season. So even though those aren't technically cash games, if you're taking all this time to be building these lineups and you're not getting paid off when your lineup is great, then you're doing yourself a huge disservice. If you're if you're spending hours building a cash game lineup and you're just posting 100 head-to-heads and not putting it in anything else, you're probably going to lose. I mean, that's just the you have to be so damn good at cash games to win that way, to be able to win head-to-heads that consistently. And you can do it, sure, like work really hard and do it, that's fine. But I would rather just look at it as kind of, I use a poker analogy all the time. Like I'm always just trying to like break even between my heaters, right? So yeah, if you're 9 weeks into the season and you're like up 5% or down 5%, you might think like, what's the point of this? Well, if you aren't playing these big multipliers or giving yourself upside in your cash games, yeah, maybe you shouldn't be playing. But if you are doing those things, you're going to have weeks where you 10x your buy-in with your cash lineup. And then that makes your season, right?
Yeah, exactly. And to add to that, I usually hate this analogy, but to compare fantasy football and DFS in general to the stock market in this circumstance, really what we're experiencing here is just that hovering right around the zero line.
Yeah.
And so by building in that upside, we are building in the spike of the stock that exists in that market as well. So I'm gonna end the metaphor right there. But the point being is that we are not building these lineups to get huge ROI every single week, and yet we can do it because sometimes the optimal actually is what we think it is going into the weekend. And when we just need to make sure when we are right, we get the payoff. And just like you said, we just need to be really right one or two times, and we're pretty set in cash games.
Yeah, we only have 18 weeks now to recognize that. So you are going to have some long stretches of where you're not just returning much. And also, like you've said multiple times, give yourself more opportunities. If you are really a skilled player, play more slates, and that gives you that instead of playing 18 weeks, you have 36 weeks, like in theory. So do that. Hopefully that helps some people that are struggling with the concept of cash games. And hopefully people start winning more. If you are here on YouTube, please go check out our DFS MVP on the on any major podcast network. All of our other shows are there. Before you do that, make sure you give us a like on YouTube on this video and follow the 4for4 channel. Those other shows that I mentioned, every Friday, Matt and I have the DFS MVP podcast at 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time, streaming here on YouTube, also on the podcast feed every Saturday. DFS, Yahoo DFS Values with Matt Harmon of Yahoo Fantasy Football. That is on both the DFS MVP and the Yahoo podcast feeds. GPP Last Look Show every Sunday morning with Jordan Vanek. That is on the subscriber-only Discord channel. You could sign up for that in the description below. 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time every Sunday. And make sure you follow us on Twitter. 4for4 is at 4for4 Football. Matt is at Draftaholic. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We'll talk to you guys on Friday.